Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons and business lessons from the first 45 years of Dungeons & Dragons history. So we're going to cover Dungeons & Dragons history from 1974 to today, 2019. That's 45 years of history. And we're going to talk about one business lesson today, and that is being, and this can be learned from Dungeons & Dragons history. Okay, this business lesson can be learned from looking at Dungeons & Dragons history, and the lesson is bean counters executing well can save a company from artists executing poorly, but artists executing well cannot save a company from bean counters executing poorly. All right. So let me define my terms. When I say bean counters, I mean managers, right? People who count the money, people who move the money, people who pay money, people who deal with the business aspects of a company, right? There's money that flows in, there's money that flows out, taxes, paying employees, insurance, all this kind of stuff. Every single company has real business aspects, and those aspects are incredibly important, and you need bean counters who are in the company who are executing well, okay? Now, it often happens... Okay, let's define the artist term as well. So what I mean when I talk about artists, well, from the perspective of Dungeons & Dragons and all tabletop role-playing games, the artists come in a lot of different flavors. They come as writers. Writers are artists. They come as layout experts, laying out the pictures and the text. That's an artist. Rules designers, they're artists, right? And then there are visual artists, artists who actually do traditional art that you would expect, right? Pictures and images of dragons and wizards and fighters. That's the traditional aspect of artists. But everyone who actually creates a tabletop role-playing game is an artist who's not a bean counter. All right, now, with that said, we do know that in many, many, many tabletop role-playing games companies, and actually D&D had this problem as well for a period of time. It will be artists who put on a bean counter hat, right? And that almost never works out well. It doesn't work out well in almost any company, right? The bean counting skill set is incredibly specific, and it needs to be executed extremely well. And frankly, artists are often the absolute worst people to allow to wear the bean counter hat, right? And I would argue that bean counter is not a hat. It is a real role, right? Like if you're, it is a real business role, and you need good bean counters. By the way, I'm not using that term derogatorily, right? I think that the term bean counter is useful and actually is not a derogatory term. All right, so, but it also it's catchy, and it gives the idea of what we're talking about here. All right, because the history of Dungeons & Dragons really has a lot of conflict between bean counters and artists, right? And there have been times where bean counters executed extremely well and artists executed poorly, and there were times when artists executed poorly and bean counters, and there were times where bean counters executed poorly and artists executed really well. All right, so let's talk about that. We're going to talk about it backwards, okay? The time when bean counters executed very, very well and artists had executed poorly, that is incredibly clear in Dungeons & Dragons history, is the year 2008. All right, so in 2008, Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition was released. The owner of the company, I'll give a history of the ownership for Dungeons & Dragons. 1974 to 1997, Dungeons & Dragons is owned by TSR. 1997 to 1999, Dungeons & Dragons is owned by Wizards of the Coast. 1999 to 2019, current day, Dungeons & Dragons is owned by Hasbro. Okay? All right. So in 2008, Dungeons & Dragons is owned by Hasbro. Okay? Toy company. 2008, Hasbro releases 4th edition. All right? Without a doubt, 4th edition was the most dangerous addition to Dungeons & Dragons in the entire history of the game, right? 4th edition absolutely sundered the player base, and half the players, easily half, walked away, and you could see proof of this when Paizo brought out Pathfinder, which actually outsold Dungeons & Dragons. It was the first time any game ever, any fantasy tabletop role-playing game had ever outsold Dungeons & Dragons. But Pathfinder did it for a brief period in time. And when they did it, they rejoiced. They were very celebratory, and they really kind of rubbed Hasbro's face in it. It was not good. It was not a good situation, all right? So basically, 4th edition absolutely split in half the player base for Dungeons & Dragons. Made a lot of Dungeon Masters upset, a lot of players upset, and people were like, this is World of Warcraft bound into a paper volume, and I don't want to play it, right? People were like, this game is just an attempt to bring tactical video game play to a tabletop role-playing game. And it really frustrated a lot of people, right? All right, now here's the thing. This is 9 years after Hasbro has bought Dungeons & Dragons. And at this point, Dungeons & Dragons is under the umbrella of Hasbro Bean Counters. And Hasbro runs their company like that company is tight as a drum, right? From the year 2000, the stock for Hasbro was $10. The stock for Hasbro today is $115, tenfold in 20 years, in less than 20 years. Tenfold increase in stock value in less than 20 years. The bean counters are absolute, like, max. Like, at, they are absolute max at bean counting, all right? And bean counters were executing extremely well. And there was a crisis in Dungeons & Dragons, but it did not matter, right? And the reason why was Hasbro's bean counters had saved for a rainy day. And when the rainy day of Dungeons & Dragons hit, right, the bean counters had it handled. They're like, hey, we have other revenues coming in from other products. You know, My Little Pony is going to make sure that you get your Dungeons & Dragons paycheck for writing this terrible version of Dungeons & Dragons that splintered the entire player base, right? So that is a time in Dungeons & Dragons history where bean counters executing well saved the company, right? Saved the game from artists executing poorly. Now, also notice, right? I'm not saying they were bad artists or that they were good bean counters. They were just bean counters executing well, and they were artists executing poorly. And that does happen. There are good artists who execute poorly at specific times within their career. It happens. All right. Now, let's look at the other side of the equation. That other side of the equation is that artists executing well cannot save a company from bean counters executing poorly. All right, let's get into it. It is my opinion that on at least 2 occasions between 1974 and 1997, there were 2 major business fails under TSR. Okay, so we're going to look at the bean counters and their poor execution under TSR, and the very good execution of artists. Right? Okay. All right. So one, basically, I don't think it really can't be argued that the artistry of TSR was not executed well. One, Dungeons & Dragons, the invention of Dungeons & Dragons was incredible. It really changed the market. It created a game that there had never been anything like it before, right? Dungeons & Dragons is a vector. It is a vector for art, literature, and play, right? Nothing in the world has existed before it, and frankly, I'm not sure there's been an innovation that's been as cool since, right? Especially in gaming, right? It's a truly incredible, very unique, and special product, right? In addition to that, the artists between 1974 and 1997 continued to execute extremely well. There were some really amazing, Planescape came out during that time. Dark Sun came out during that time. Forgotten Realms came out during that time. Greyhawk came out during that time. The Orange Spine Easley books came out during that time. There were beautiful, gorgeous box sets that did a redux of the play rules, right? The Moldvay box set is considered a classic, right? There are and also artistry, visual artistry for fantasy, right? Absolutely went through the roof. It is arguable that Dungeons & Dragons set a new standard for visual artistry within the fantasy genre, right? Better than anything that had ever been seen under the Tolkien era, better than anything that had ever been seen under the fantasy rock and roll album cover era, and frankly, better than anything that had ever been seen under the fantasy novel era, right? It really was incredibly important, and it was extremely well done, right? So, basically the artistry for rules design, for visual artistry, for layout, for the actual writing within the books, the artistry was fantastic between 1974 and 1997 at the macro level, right? And it was really groundbreaking, innovative, and quite unique, right? However, the bean counting between 1974 and 1997 was absolutely not innovative, unique, or special, right? Like, there was a ton of mistakes that happened. The first mistake that happened is the game comes out in 1974, okay? In 1986, Dungeons & Dragons loses Gary Gygax. The bean counters were in a brutal fight with the main artist for the title, right? Now, Gary Gygax had put on the bean counter hat, and he was right in the mix, right? But here's the thing. Basically, I'm not sure if you know this. You ever work for a manager? There's this thing called managing up, right? And there's things called managing sideways, right? When you have artists and you are a bean counter, you have to be able to talk to them with respect and kindness. You have to be able to communicate to them in a way that an artist understands, right? And the bean counters within TSR failed to adequately and kindly or respectfully communicate with Gary Gygax in a way that allowed him to remain with the company, right? There were absolutely, and I'm sure that Gary Gygax, was not blameless in what happened, right? But the reality is, if you have a game and your creator gets disconnected from that game, that's a blow. That is almost never a good thing, right? And at minimum, it should have been amicable, right? And it did not seem like it was amicable, right? And it's a it's a dark era within the history of Dungeons & Dragons when Gary Gygax left TSR. And it's a dark mark on the history of Dungeons & Dragons without exception. All right, let's talk about 1997. In 1997, basically, Dungeons & Dragons had chosen way too many product lines, right? And again, a failure for the bean counters to talk with the artists and say, hey, you guys can't have Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms, right? They're the same thing. Pick one. You absolutely do not need both of these, right? And then also for them to say, hey, maybe we don't need 15 different settings, right? Maybe we need 3 settings or 4 settings, right? And so there were too many settings. The settings were cannibalizing each other, right? They were printing way too many different number of books, not the amount of each book, but there were just too many Dungeons & Dragons books that were coming out, right? And the player base could not keep up with it. The dungeon masters couldn't keep up with it. And it was very poorly executed from a bean counter perspective. What's even worse is they were selling books, literally hundreds of thousands of books, to Barnes & Nobles, and Barnes & Nobles had a return policy, right? And when people stopped buying Dungeons & Dragons books, they started returning them, and TSR went upside down to the tune of $30 million owed, right? And that $30 million debt allowed Wizards of the Coast to sweep in and buy TSR, the entire company, lock, stock, and barrel, away from them. So that is an example, that is, in my opinion, evidence, right, that artists executing well cannot save a company from bean counters executing poorly. All that is my opinion. I'd love to hear your opinion. What do you think? Can you think of counter examples, especially within TRPGs, where artists executing well actually did save a company from bean counters executing poorly? I'm more than willing to hear counter examples if you have any. Throw them in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.